All right, welcome back to Study Hall, everybody. Ready for another deep dive.
Always ready to learn something new.
Today, we're going to be taking a look at something that sounds, I'll be honest, a little bit intimidating at first. We're talking about sovereign wealth funds.
Yeah, not exactly light dinner conversation.
Right, but stick with us because this is actually super relevant to, well, everyone. And frankly, it's not as complicated as it sounds once you break it down.
Absolutely. And the idea is gaining some serious traction here in the US, so it's worth understanding.
Okay, so for those of us who haven't exactly been brushing up on our international finance lately,
Mhm.
can we start with the basics? What is a sovereign wealth fund?
Well, imagine the US had this massive investment account, right? Like a national piggy bank. But instead of just holding cash, it's out there investing in stuff, growing that money for the future.
Okay, that makes sense. So like a national savings account, but way more proactive.
Exactly. And countries all over the world are already doing this.
So this isn't some brand new, untested idea.
Nope, not at all. In fact, some countries have been using these funds for decades with incredible success.
Okay, so who are the all-stars here? Who should we be looking at as examples?
Well, Norway is a great example. They've built one of the biggest sovereign wealth funds in the world, funded mainly by their oil revenue.
Oil, huh? So basically, they took a resource that could have just been spent and turned it into this long-term investment.
Yeah, and now that fund is worth, get this, over $1 trillion.
A trillion. I mean, it's just an insane amount of money. But does that mean this is like a strategy for countries that just happen to be sitting on tons of oil or other valuable resources?
Not necessarily. It can definitely give those countries a head start, but the U.S. plan actually takes a different approach.
How so?
Well, the White House is proposing a more diversified strategy. They're talking about things like government bonds, maybe even private equity.
Hmm. So spreading the risk, not putting all their eggs in one basket. And what's the overall goal here? Just to make a bunch of money for the government.
It's more than that, actually. The plan talks about using this fund to create more financial stability for the U.S., maybe even help reduce the tax burden on everyday Americans. Ambitious, right?
Okay, hold on. Reduce taxes. How is that supposed to work?
The idea is that if this fund is managed well, it could start generating enough returns to cover some government expenses. And that could potentially lead to lower taxes or at least help avoid future tax hikes.
Okay, so kind of like creating an alternative source of income for the government.
Precisely. But it's a long game, not a quick fix.
That makes sense. But I've also been hearing a lot about global leverage in relation to this whole sovereign wealth fund thing. What's that all about? Is this about more than just financial stability for the U.S.?
Yeah, you're right on the money with that. There's definitely a geopolitical angle here. The idea is that by strategically investing in global markets, the U.S. could gain more influence on the world stage.
So it's like financial power translating into international influence? I mean, I guess that makes sense. But okay, let's get real for a second. What are the risks here? Every investment has downsides, right? And this isn't some Wall Street hotshot playing with their own money. We're talking about taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, that's the million or trillion-dollar question, right? And to be fair, the White House plan does acknowledge that there are some legal hurdles to figure out.
Okay, so they know there are challenges.
Yeah, and I mean, let's be honest, the potential for political influence on investment decisions is a legitimate concern.
Right. The last thing we need is this turning into another partisan battleground.
Mhm.
So knowing those risks, what are some things that folks should watch out for? Like what could indicate that things are going off track?
Well, I think transparency is going to be huge here. If the decision-making process around these investments starts getting murky, if it seems like certain industries or companies are being favored for political reasons rather than sound financial strategy, that's a big red flag.
Absolutely. So we have a plan, but as with so many things, the devil's in the details.
Exactly. And speaking of details, the Treasury and Commerce Secretaries actually have a pretty tight deadline here.
Oh, yeah. How long do they have to figure all this out?
90 days.
90 days to figure out how to fund this thing, what to invest in, how to manage it all. Well, that's certainly a lot to get done. So a lot is still up in the air, which honestly I think makes this even more interesting. But I guess the big question for our listeners is, what does all this mean for them? Why should they care about sovereign wealth funds?
I think that's the perfect question for everyone to consider. Like, if this thing does become a reality, what kind of investments would you want to see prioritized? What would make you feel confident that your tax dollars are being used responsibly?
Those are some great questions to ponder. And as this whole story unfolds, we'll definitely be keeping a close eye on it all. So stay curious, and we'll see you back here in Study Hall soon. for another deep dive.